All right, so get this. We're diving deep into Adam Smith, but not just the economics this time. We're tackling his political philosophy, and specifically this idea of spontaneous order.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is. Everyone knows about invisible hands in markets, but we've got excerpts here that go way beyond that. We're talking about how things like morality, law, even government itself can kind of sprout up without anyone planning it.
It really does make you rethink how societies work, right?
Right.
Like we assume someone's in charge, designing it all.
Exactly, but spontaneous order is saying, well, maybe not. Maybe some of the most complex stuff just emerges from us interacting. And we've got Adam Smith, of course, but also thinkers like Hayek and Popper who really ran with these ideas later on.
Right, they took it in some fascinating directions.
They did. One thing that jumped out at me, though, from the Smith excerpts is how he and the other Scottish Enlightenment folks viewed science. It wasn't just about finding facts, it was.
It was driven by wonder, wasn't it?
Yes, like a need to explain the unexpected. Smith even uses this analogy of an opera house, all the spectacle on stage.
Then you go behind the scenes and see the ropes and pulleys, how it all works.
Exactly. So is understanding the world like that, does it ruin the magic?
Maybe a bit, but it also gives you this deeper appreciation for the mechanisms. And for the Scots, especially when they were trying to understand the past, where you don't always have clear evidence.
Right, like trying to figure out how things became a certain way.
They used conjectural history, basically constructing the most plausible story based on what clues you've got.
Like historical detective work.
Exactly. And that becomes crucial when they start talking about morality, because for them, morality wasn't something handed down from on high.
Not like commandments from God or a king.
Right. It was something that emerged from how we interact.
Mm-hmm.
Smith had this idea of sympathy.
Which it doesn't just mean feeling sorry for someone, right?
No, it's more about this natural tendency we have to care about what others think of us, and that shapes our behavior. Think about it. You don't act the same way at a fancy dinner as you would hanging out with friends.
Oh, totally. Like we're always reading the room, trying to figure out the unspoken rules.
And the fascinating thing is, this system adapts over time. One of the excerpts even used the example of infanticide.
Whoa, okay. Heavy topic there.
Yeah, it might seem shocking. But the point is, even a practice that seems morally wrong to us now can emerge from certain circumstances. Like, in some societies, extreme poverty. Well, it led to that. But as those circumstances changed, so did the moral code.
So spontaneous order isn't saying things are fixed. It's more like they're constantly responding and evolving.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to a concept that gets thrown around a lot, but often misunderstood, the invisible hand.
Oh, yeah, the invisible hand. I'll admit, I used to think it was like God intervening in economics or something.
A lot of people think that.
Yeah.
But sticking with Smith's approach, which was very secular, it's less about God, more about the unintended consequences of what we do. Like, when people act in their own self-interest, it can actually end up benefiting everyone.
So we're all playing our own games, but somehow those games create a bigger game that nobody planned?
Precisely. Smith's classic example, right?
Yeah.
The butcher, the brewer, the baker, they're not working hard just to be nice to us.
They want to make a living.
Right. But by doing that, they're giving us food, drinks, all this essential stuff.
So it's not about people consciously aiming for the common good. It's like their self-interest within the right framework accidentally makes things good for everyone.
And what's even wilder, this can be applied to how law and government develop too,
Wait, so you're saying nobody sat down one day and was like, let's invent laws? It just kind of happened.
Well, it's more nuanced than that. But the idea is law, like language or morality, it evolved over time. Trial and error, adaptation, refinement, less like a machine, more like an ecosystem, you could say.
Okay, so if law is an ecosystem, what about something like private property? Someone had to invent that, right?
Hayek had some interesting thoughts about that. He said it emerged not just from greed, but because it actually minimizes conflict, lets people use what they know effectively.
Huh. So private property isn't just about stuff. It's like a way to make sure we don't step on each other's toes all the time.
Right. Clear boundaries mean we can predict what others will do, which makes everything run smoother. And for Hayek, this emphasis on general rules, on predictability, that's key. Because it means we don't need to know everything going on to function in society.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connections here. So morality, law, they emerge spontaneously, but what about markets? Someone had to design those, they're too complex.
And that's where Hayek's insights about knowledge come in. He said no single person could possibly know enough to plan an entire economy. There's just too much information spread out everywhere.
Like trying to micromanage an anthill, telling each ant what to do.
Exactly. Think about your coffee this morning. The beans, the roasting, the shipping, the brewing. It's mind-boggling that it even works without someone controlling every step.
Right. And Hayek was fascinated by that, how markets coordinate millions of people without anyone being in charge. So how does it happen? What's the secret?
The secret, if you want to call it that, is prices.
Prices.
Yeah, prices. They act like signals, telling everyone about supply and demand, what's scarce, what people want.
So instead of someone trying to figure out how much coffee to make and where to send it, the market just does it automatically through prices going up or down.
Exactly. And that's why Hayek was skeptical of those perfect competition models, the ones economists love.
Yeah, where everyone has perfect information and acts perfectly rationally.
Right, because the real world is messy. We don't have perfect knowledge. Things are always changing.
So the messiness is actually good. It's what lets the system adapt.
Precisely. But even with all its wonders, there are limits to spontaneous order. And this brings us to what's called the public goods problem.
Oh yeah, there's always a catch.
Right. So what about things like education or national defense? Things everyone needs, but the market doesn't handle well on its own. Does that mean spontaneous order is a bust? Not at all. Even Adam Smith said there are certain things the market can't do well. He saw a role for government in providing these public goods stuff that benefits everyone, but is hard to do through pure buying and selling.
So it's not black and white. It's about finding the right balance between the market doing its thing and the government stepping in sometimes.
Exactly. And that raises a huge question. Where do we draw that line? When does the invisible hand need a little help? And when does too much help mess everything up?
Ooh, that is a big one. And that's actually a debate we're going to get even deeper into as we look at Hayek and Popper next time. But before we go there, let's zoom out for a second. What does all this mean for us? Just regular folks trying to make sense of the world.
Because if we accept that spontaneous order is this powerful force shaping our societies, our economies, even our morals, it changes how we approach problems, how we think about progress, maybe even how we define freedom itself.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the world through this whole spontaneous order lens now. It's a different way of understanding how things work. But before we go full let it all emerge, there's another thinker we should talk about, right? Karl Popper. He kind of adds a twist to all this.
He does. He's crucial here. Popper agreed with Hayek about, the limits of what we can know, that no single person can have all the knowledge to design a perfect system or whatever. But then Popper takes it further, saying we need this critical rationalism thing.
So it's not enough to just let things evolve randomly. We got to be actively testing our ideas, seeing if they hold up.
Exactly. For Popper, progress isn't about finding the right answer and being done. It's like constantly poking at what we think we know, trying to prove ourselves wrong.
Almost like a game, but with really high stakes.
He called it conjecture and refutation. You throw out a bold idea, then do your best to tear it apart.
So the more we disprove, the closer we get to the truth. Sounds kind of backwards.
But that's how knowledge actually grows. Not by being certain, but by getting rid of the wrong stuff. And this applies to social systems too, not just science.
So even if we can't design the perfect society from scratch, we can still use our brains to nudge things in a better direction.
Exactly. We can study how these spontaneous orders work, see their strengths and weaknesses, and then tweak things based on what we learn.
We're gardeners, not engineers, right? Tending to this complex thing rather than trying to build it from Lego blocks.
Great analogy. And that brings us back to one of Hayek's big ideas, the division of knowledge. All that information spread out amongst people.
Each of us only has a tiny piece of the puzzle.
Right. And Hayek was adamant that central planning fails because it tries to cram all that knowledge into one tiny space, like the government or some expert panel. Information gets lost, different viewpoints get squashed.
Because no matter how smart those planners are, they can't know as much as everyone combined.
Precisely. Hayek saw the market, with its signals, as a much better way to use this spread-out knowledge. Prices are like summaries of millions of transactions showing what people actually want and need.
So prices are like a giant feedback loop telling the whole system what to do, much faster than any planner could, right?
Right. People might not even know the big picture. They're just reacting to what's going on around them, the prices they see. But all those little decisions add up to something huge and complex.
It's kind of beautiful when you think about it, like an orchestra where nobody's conducting, but the music still works.
It is quite elegant. But we did mention earlier, even spontaneous order has its limits, that public goods problem we talked about.
Right. Things that everyone benefits from, but nobody wants to pay for directly. So did Hayek just say, tough luck, let them figure it out, no government involvement at all?
Actually, no. Hayek was very much for limited government, but he saw a role for it in providing those public goods, like national defense, legal systems, basic infrastructure.
So not no government, but the right kind of government. One that sets the stage but doesn't try to write the whole play, right?
Exactly. For Hayek, this meant clear rules, enforcing contracts, protecting people's rights, and then getting out of the way for the most part.
Referee, not puppet master.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And he was really worried about governments trying to micromanage the economy or social life, forcing their idea of good on everyone.
Because that kind of top-down thinking, it stifles creativity, right? Like stops the good stuff from happening naturally.
Hayek called it the fatal conceit, thinking we can design complex systems better than they can design themselves.
So we've seen spontaneous order in markets, morals, even government. But how does this connect to society as a whole? Like, what's the takeaway for everyday life?
That's where things get really interesting. It's like we have to shift from seeing things as top-down, someone always in charge, to a view where things emerge from the bottom up.
So instead of assuming someone's always got to be at the steering wheel, we start appreciating how things bubble up organically, people making their own choices.
And those choices, all added together, often lead to stuff nobody could have predicted. And this changes how we solve problems, how we see progress, even what we think freedom means.
Because if it's all about people figuring things out on their own, there's got to be space for that, right? To experiment, do things differently.
That's the beauty of it. Spontaneous order allows for way more individual expression and initiative than a system where someone's calling all the shots.
But, I mean, surely some people push back against this whole idea. Not everyone's going to be on board with just letting things happen, right?
Of course, there are criticisms we got to address. One big one is that spontaneous order leads to inequality. The idea that if we just let everything evolve, those with power and money will just stay on top.
So it becomes a survival of the fittest situation, which isn't always fair or ethical.
Exactly. And those who really believe in spontaneous order, they got to take that criticism seriously. They'd say the way to deal with it is to make sure everyone has an equal shot.
So not just letting things unfold randomly, but making sure the starting line is fair for everyone. Addressing poverty, discrimination, all those things.
Right. Because if some people are shut out from the start, spontaneous order might just make things worse.
Another criticism I've heard is, what about urgent problems, like a pandemic or a climate crisis? You can't just sit back and wait for solutions to magically appear, right?
That's a valid point. It shows the context matters. Spontaneous order isn't a magic wand you wave at everything. Sometimes you do need quick, decisive action, coordinated from the top.
So it's a tool, not a dogma.
Exactly. And that's the core of all this understanding. Spontaneous order isn't just an academic exercise. It's about seeing the world's complexity, admitting that we don't know everything, and then figuring out how to work with that complexity to make things better.
It's making me rethink everything, not just economics, but how language changes, how science works, how we build a fairer world.
And this is where Hayek's work gets really relevant. He saw this deep link between spontaneous order and individual liberty, because when systems emerge organically, they're less reliant on control and force.
So people have more freedom to do their own thing, be themselves, without someone constantly breathing down their neck.
Exactly. The system itself becomes more adaptable, tolerant of different ideas and people. Hayek saw this as the opposite of totalitarianism, which tries to fit everyone into the same mold.
So it's not just about efficiency, then. It's about a society where people can actually thrive, contribute what makes them unique.
And that's where the ethical side comes in. Hayek thought that a society based on spontaneous order is more likely to be a moral society.
Because people develop their own sense of right and wrong, not just following orders.
And it encourages cooperation, even without someone watching over us all the time.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between freedom and responsibility, right? Where people are both in charge of their own lives and accountable to each other.
That's the ideal, yeah. And this is why Hayek is so important now, as we face all these huge challenges, and top-down solutions aren't always working. He offers a different way to think about things, starting with individual empowerment and bottom-up change.
It's like trusting in people's ability to create a better world, not through big, sweeping plans, but through the wisdom and creativity that comes from a truly free society. Wow, this whole conversation has really changed how I see things. I'm noticing spontaneous order everywhere now, like how traffic moves, how online groups form, heck, even how language itself changes over time.
It's like we've got this new set of glasses for looking at the world. Things that seemed random before, and now you start to see the patterns, how it all kind of clicks together.
And the cool thing is, it's not just theory, right? It actually affects how we deal with problems, how we build organizations, how much freedom we give people. It's all connected.
It is. It's like we don't always need to be in control. Sometimes the best thing to do is step back and let things sort themselves out. But, even with spontaneous order, there are different flavors, like Smith, Hayek, Popper. They agreed on a lot, but they didn't always see eye to eye on how it all works or the best ways to encourage it.
Right. Like, they were all into free markets, but even there, they had different ideas about what the government should do. Smith seemed okay with some rules, while Hayek was more hands-off.
Exactly. And even within Hayek's own work, his thinking shifted over time. Later on, he put more emphasis on tradition, on how culture evolves. Kind of like those are ingredients in the spontaneous order recipe.
So it's not just about what people do right now, it's also about all the stuff that's been passed down, the values and ways of doing things we inherit.
Exactly. He's saying those traditions, those norms and institutions that have developed, they provide a framework, right? It's not a blank slate. They guide people's choices, even if they don't realize it.
So even spontaneous order needs a starting point, like some shared foundation to build on.
And it highlights something else, too. Spontaneous order isn't frozen in time. It changes, just like everything else. What worked a few centuries ago might not be the best way now.
Which means we got to keep reevaluating, questioning what we think we know, updating things based on new info.
And with all the crazy challenges we face, like climate change, AI, all this tech disruption, we got to be open to new ways of using these principles, maybe even tweaking them to create new types of spontaneous order, ones that fit these specific problems.
That's a mind-blowing thought. What if we could intentionally design systems that use spontaneous order to solve these huge problems?
It's tricky though, right? We don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg, so to speak. But it's worth thinking about. Imagine institutions that are built to encourage bottom-up innovation, where people want to work together and share what they know, where everyone's part of finding the solution, not just waiting for someone to tell them what to do.
It's less about controlling things, more about setting the right conditions, right? Like gardening instead of engineering. You can't force a plant to grow, but you can give it the best environment.
Exactly. And this requires a different mindset, not just from leaders or institutions, but from all of us.
Yeah.
We got to think about the ripple effects of our actions, be willing to try things out and, maybe fail sometimes, and realize that we're all players in this giant spontaneous order game, whether we know it or not.
So at the end of all this, I'm feeling kind of awestruck, but also a little more responsible. Like, all these systems are so complex and kind of beautiful, the way they work. But we also have a role to play, right? Understanding them, making sure they actually benefit everyone.
It's a never-ending process, yeah.
Sure.
Figuring things out, adapting. And it takes all of us to do it right, not just the experts, but everyday people, too.
Because spontaneous order isn't something that happens to us, it's something we create together through our choices, how we treat each other, the systems we build.
So if this deep dive has gotten you thinking, don't stop here. Go check out the sources. Keep asking those tough questions. Challenge your own assumptions.
Because the more we understand about spontaneous order, the better we can deal with all the crazy stuff happening in the world and hopefully build a future where people are free, creative, and can actually thrive.
Thanks for being with us on this journey. We'll see you next time.